Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Long.
We've heard the terms perestroika and glasnost as the Soviet Union looked at its long-term image and how it changes world opinion about the Soviet Union, how it operates, how its people are treated. And then we hear this past week about the United States Navy shooting down an Iranian airliner. How does the United States deal with a short-term and perhaps long-term image problem in regard to that kind of tragedy? Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we're going to talk about the political approach and other approaches to public relations. Is selling an image, be it corporate or political, any different from selling soap? Our panelists today are Jack Miller, who is Vice President for University Advancement at Ball State University, Mel Sharp, Professor and Coordinator of the Public Relations Sequence in the Journalism Department at Ball State, and John Rouse, Executive Producer of Public Affairs Roundtable and a member of the Political Science faculty. Mel, is the approach, is the strategy involved in selling a political image any different from selling a corporate image?
I don't see any real difference. You're basically dealing with some principles that really serve us in terms of developing relationships. And we have to remember that honesty and openness are two essential factors for credibility. And we're also dealing with attitudes toward fairness. And I'm talking about public opinion attitudes and attitudes of the parties involved. And so the fairness concept comes in here. So we're certainly dealing with those three aspects in particular. And whether it's a corporation or a nation, public opinion is formed in relation to the perceptions of those three factors.
Openness and honesty. I mentioned at the top about Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts to change the image. I think openness and honesty would be a couple of things that are not generally associated with the Soviet Union. That must be a heck of a job trying to change that kind of image.
Yes, although we see him literally, whether he's being forced by public opinion and recognizing that change is occurring in the world that is going to make this a requirement for the Soviet Union if it's going to remain viable as a nation in the global situation or not, but whatever is happening, those pressures are occurring, and as a result he is moving to a position that is more democratic, which means greater openness. And the recent conference in which he had his comments televised live for about 4 or 5 hours there, which was a breakthrough in terms of Soviet policy, indicates his recognition that he needed the support of the Soviet people. And so he was really applying some of the techniques that we would apply in this country in terms of making sure that our communication reaches those who will form the opinion.
Jack, public relations sometimes has the image of making something of something that's not there. We had former House Speaker Bob Daley on this program a couple of weeks ago to talk about lobbyists, and his opinion was that there are no liars among lobbyists because as soon as one lobbyist lies and is found out, he loses his credibility. Mm-hmm. Mel says basically you need substance, you need something to start with, and that has to be the basis of good public relations.
Well, I think you have to be prepared to live with what you sell. Mel said that in a different way, but you can make things look a lot better than they really are, but sooner or later with the test of time you have to be able to defend what it is you've created. There are many universities in this country, which is an area I have an interest in, who are probably viewed to be much better by the general public than they really are when you look at them from an educational standpoint or from a research standpoint. And that may be because of the fact they've gone out and bought distinguished faculty, or they have a successful athletic program, or that they've recruited the right kinds of students. But I think if people think about higher education, you think about major universities in this country, there are some of them who look a lot better than they really are. It's not to say they're bad. It's just to say that there aren't too many Harvards and Dartmouths and so on around.
And like a political entity, I would assume that a university would get an image, would get a stereotype even that, for example, Ball State is a teacher's college. and that's what it is. And it cannot always be easy to change that kind of image.
Yeah, you're changing things that have been developed over a long period of time, and these are images that are not current images, they're images that have been passed down through a couple of generations. That takes time to change, I think, and it takes a lot of work. It takes an aggressive posture on the part of an institution, whether it's Ball State or Harvard or Miami of Ohio or whoever it is. The key thing here is you have to set out initially to decide what it is we want people to look at, how they want to see us. What do we want to be perceived as? Do we want to be perceived as a multiple-purpose university with an interest in excellent teaching, as maybe one of the premier teaching institutions in the Midwest? That is a goal that we think is realistic for Ball State and one that we're setting out to try and accomplish.
So what comes out first, in fact, the new game plan out of the administration building or the brochures? Or do they come at the same time?
In some ways, they kind of come together. I'm not sure one leads to the other. I think then fairly soon you have to have demonstrable feats that say to the world, whether it be the students or the faculty or the citizens of Indiana, that we are in fact doing those things necessary to put ourselves at the level we aspire to be at. To say that you have to do one before the other, I think they all kind of mesh together. There is usually a game plan in any public relations strategy, and Mel teaches us some superb courses over in the journalism program at Ball State that deal with corporate strategy or with strategies, whether you're a nonprofit institution or whether you're in the corporate world. There are game plans developed in order to create the image that you're trying to create. That's not to say that we're trying to do anything real special. I mean, we are a very good educational institution. We're not going to run away and hide from that. That's what we want to be known as, but we want to carve out our little niche in life. Everybody's trying to do that.
And I think that we can put this into a larger perspective, even talking about politics, because in the last 20 years, politics, of course, has changed. And as Mel has said, public relations affects the Soviet Union in terms of Gorbachev's policy. It affects Ball State University. It also affects the Pentagon. At the bottom line, it seems to be truth. But let me get back to politics. It seems that consumerism has affected all these institutions. Consumerism in the Soviet Union, consumerism in terms of what will the public buy in terms of the Iran airliner being shot down. Consumerism in terms of education. Consumerism in terms of international politics. For example, we have a lot of international students on our campuses around the country. So even this international politics puts us all in a larger perspective. So something else I could focus on. In a sense, in the last 30 years, authority has been debunked. In a sense, this debunking of authority puts a great deal of pressure upon the individual to sort out what is truth, whether you're selling soap or selling education or selling international politics.
Well, consumerism, I guess, to follow up on that question, Jack, you can answer. Consumerism then would seem to be that we don't always believe what we hear. Maybe at one time we revered the president and believed everything he said. Maybe we always trusted the automaker or the product maker. But today we demand some more answers. We demand more information.
Well, I think that when we use the word information age or the age of information, I think that's what we really have if you break it down to the simplest of terms. We have more information available to us on any aspect of life or the world than we've ever had before. We have faster means to distribute news. You know, if you think about what has happened since the advent of television and its growth, and particularly in our society, in America. If you go to the Soviet Union, it's fine, he's on television for 4 hours, but does a typical Soviet home have a television set? And do they have access to that information? Or is it only through the written word of their newspapers? But if you look at what's happened in the United States and in the free world by and large, there's been an explosion of information available, news-wise. I think Turner Broadcasting, I think that's changed the whole complexion of news in this society. Because now, whether you work the third shift, the second shift, or the day shift, you can pick up current news within literally minutes of the event happening. The Iranian air incident, or whether it's a bombing of Libya. I mean, that's instantaneous news available and goes around the world today in a matter of moments. Then people begin to draw their perceptions. You know, was that a military transponder in that plane? All these issues. And the longer the story is in front of the people, the more news, the more information tends to come out about it. And the more that people draw suppositions and begin to think about, well, maybe, you know, is this what it appears to be or is it something else?
I see really three factors at work here, and one of them is certainly what you're talking about, Jack, this explosion in communications technology, as well as what you're saying, John, the economic factor. The economic factors may be the strongest public opinion pressures that we have, but also world population growth is another factor here, and all three of those are coming together to increase our social interdependence, and as a result we are out of necessity becoming more democratic as a society, and that in part is due to our great diversity. And so truly organizations of all types, whether it's a corporation, a university, or a government, has so many different diverse publics than it used to have that it has to pay attention to and learn about how they feel about situations. So it's a much more complex task than it used to be in terms of how we need to communicate and how we have to communicate to reach these groups.
You know, a quick aside that brings us really close to our viewers, I think, is the current drought that Indiana and indeed the heartland of America is facing. Yesterday, the long-term weather forecaster for USDA in Washington announced that next week there was a break, if I remember the news right, that came across early yesterday morning. If you wanted to watch a fury of activity, watch the commodities markets yesterday and see what they did. They were up and down and all over the place because of the fact that all of a sudden this information literally was instantaneous around the United States. People were beginning to make major financial decisions based on not rumor, but what believed fact. Now, we'll see whether or not next week the man was right and whether or not it does rain someplace.
You know, I think that brings to mind some other focuses in this regard: performance, credibility, excellence. And if you look at institutions, it seems to me, have diversified. So, for example, 20 years ago, we knew what the focus of Ball State University was. It was teaching. Now it is at least three things. It's teaching, research, and service. And so our evaluation as individuals and also as a university is in at least three areas and not just one. So as institutions have these kinds of pressures, in a sense they have to become all things to all people. And I presume that the dilemma is, can they indeed be all things to all people all the time?
Or should you really try to be all things to all people? I mean, not every institution can be a major land grant. And the philosophy you've just mentioned is really a land grant philosophy. That's why the land grant institutions of this country were founded, was to provide education, to provide research, and to provide a public service component. Now, the question becomes, is that necessary for every institution in the United States to provide all three? Or are there some niches? You know, there's some room for institutions to position themselves, just like corporations position themselves. If you're the bottler of Dr. Pepper, in reality, you know you are not going to take away market share from Pepsi or Coke. You're not going to do it. But you will know through demographics or geodemographics or psychodemographics or the studies of buyers and consumers, you'll know there is a rebel out there, so to speak, who will continue to buy Dr. Pepper, because they're non-traditionalists. They don't want to be identified with all these people that drink the other particular products. That's what makes America fun to deal with from a public relations standpoint and a marketing standpoint, is you have such great diversity. And we have so many tools available to us today. I mean, the last 5 years, the tools have just gone mind-boggling, what we can figure out about people and segments of markets today.
That brings us to what I see as one very important, what I call message statement, that most organizations need to project, and you have to find how you can do it as an organization if you want stability over a long period of time. And the message statement is quality. So you can find your niche, but you've got to develop quality in that aspect of whatever it is that you're doing and project that consistently.
Well, doesn't this bring us back to values? I know that's a very broad and yet very simple concept, but as institutions seem to get pushed in different directions, but really institutions, to be viable, to be quality, have to come back to asking themselves, what are their values? What do they really stand for? What's the purpose?
I see ethics and public relations as tied together very, very closely. In fact, in order to have harmony, and really public relations is a harmonizing activity, in order to have that harmonizing activity, you have to have an ethical position in the organization that is in harmony with the larger social environment. And when you're out of harmony, then you're going to have difficulties, and you have to evaluate what that disharmony is going to do to you, both in the short range and the long range. But as I look at organizations, one thing that I strongly recommend is that all organizations have an ethical policy, and that allows an internal evaluation of performance in relation to that policy, as well as an external evaluation in relation to the policy. It also allows the press to monitor the organization in terms of what it says, and this keeps the organization healthy and on target. As far as our government, for example, our Constitution is in a sense saying what we stand for as a people, and so whenever we look at national incidents and so forth, we're always able to evaluate how this relates to what we believe we are and what we stand for as a country.
Well, are you saying as individuals, as institutions, and as a country, we better clean up our own act first, otherwise someone else is going to clean it up for us?
That's correct. In other words, if we want to be viewed well in the national, in the global social situation, then we've got to be sure that we are, as a country, what we say we are in terms of what we believe.
So it's important for the Pentagon then to get as much information out about this situation in the Persian Gulf as possible. In other words, get
Absolutely.
as much truth out to the public so that the public can make up its mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. People today, Watergate changed a lot of things. It certainly changed the enrollment of journalism schools around the United States. But it changed a lot of things because all of a sudden you had national hearings that exposed to the American people, but indeed to the world, a very tense situation, a very tense time in government in this country. And out of that, I think the ethical concerns, while they were always there, you hear the word ethics a lot. I mean, there are chairs in ethics now in universities. There's a lot more in professional societies when you go to national meetings where they're talking about ethical concerns about the profession. And those are relatively Johnny-come-lately kinds of concepts. It's always been there. But all of a sudden now, you better be careful what you say, and you better be able to back it up.
But both Jack and Mel, since you guys are experts in this area, why do you need to have a chair of ethics? I mean, shouldn't ethics just be something that's normal and natural? You know, why do we as a society and as institutions sometimes have to focus upon having a particular focus upon ethics?
Because ethics change. Ethical values continually change. And it's very difficult in today's society to really be sure that your ethical positions are something that you can know are going to be constant, and they're not. We have so many changes in society. We can look at attitudes toward pollution. We can look at attitudes toward preservation of certain species, and protection of the environment, and the attitudes toward women and minorities, and attitudes toward safety, and we can just go on and on and on, where attitudes have changed in our own society in the past 100 years, and they've changed rather dramatically. And as a result, corporations have had to respond to those public opinion, ethical attitude changes.
And in a consumer society, I would imagine just having that in place is in itself important public relations. Even if it's not needed, you need it for appearance's sake.
Sure.
But if it's not working, if it's not operating, then it isn't of any value. But you need it merely because people would expect you to have it.
You know, I often wonder, I mean, you can look at ethics, that's a big word, it covers a wide front. But, you know, it was okay to sell a hammer to the Defense Department for $5, but then when they sold it for $15, you see there's some ethical concerns that the taxpayers being ripped off. And it's okay for an individual to take their empty can of We'd Be Gone and throw it in the trash, which ends up in somebody's landfill. But it's not okay for major corporations to take 50-gallon drums of a residue and stack it up and then let that seep into groundwater supply. So there are ethical concerns that it depends on the nation. Again, there's so much information available. I mean, I saw something, a news clip the other night in East Africa of a storage dump of European countries that had dumped highly volatile chemicals. And, you know, literally masses of this dumped out in the jungle. But the problem was it was seeping into groundwater supply. That problem is a major problem, not just for Africa, but for our nation. And People today, because of the information explosion, now know that these things are bad, that if they get in the water supply, if you get high levels of nitrates, and I don't know in Indiana because I've only been here a year, but in many states in the heartlands, nitrates in the water supply, the underground water supply, are a major problem because if cities are getting their water out of wells, and you've got leaching action going on, you've got some major water quality problems, which have been caused by simply pouring nitrogen on cornfields and soybean fields and everything else, and pretty soon that catches up with you.
Which makes the point that new knowledge can change our ethical values.
You talked about the tools available today. That has to include basic polling and marketing techniques that we know at an instant, whether you're selling a candidate or you're selling soap, what the public thinks about it the next hour, the next day, and those sort of opinions change day to day, but we have the technology now to find out almost within an instant, what people really think about it.
It's scary.
Well, it is.
Because it causes lots of people to take their best laid plans and change them literally overnight. If you're coming out with a new product, and there are some communities in this country that are test markets for new products, P&G has some, where they're rigged to the supermarket. Literally, instantaneously, when you go through the supermarket checkout, that's all going into someone's computer in many stores. And it'll tell you whether or not you are correct in your theory on positioning on the shelf. It'll tell you whether or not your specials have in fact reached the buying public.
So while that UPC code is being over the scanner, it is going into somebody's computer saying this product's being bought, or
that's right.
It's been 2 days and nobody's bought that product.
It's saying it's been bought. It's said in what quantity it's being bought. It's said in what size containers it's being bought. It probably is telling you whether or not the old color things that we teach in higher education are still true. It tells you whether or not, if you think about cereal, the sugar cereals are always on the bottom shelf because little people are about that tall. The big people cereals are always on the top shelf because that's eye level. And if you look, there's a world of difference sometimes in price between little people cereals and big people cereals.
And it tells you whether it was packaged in yellow or green, so
that's
they know
right.
what the consumer.
Yeah, and whether it's got whether it says on there, if you look today, the Human Performance Laboratory here at Ball State has done a good job, I think, in this community and in the wellness program of making people aware and the nutritionists of what we're eating. And now you see consumers beginning to make real hard decisions when they go to buy a breakfast cereal or they go to buy any kind of a pre-prepared food as to what really is in that food that I'm eating. You used to see people turning materials over in a grocery store reading the ingredient label on the back.
I think a couple of things come to mind. First of all, it seems to me that institutions that are the strongest kinds of institutions are the ones that are the most open in terms of their ethics, in terms of things like complaint handling. In other words, how do institutions or firms handle complaints? And also, if we can get back to the Pentagon, I think one key issue in terms of this current crisis in the Persian Gulf is the fact that the Navy has sent a group of people to go conduct hearings, so public hearings. The fact that systems are willing to open up to secure and to seek new information. So I would guess that the strongest institutions are the ones that are most open to new ideas and new thinking.
I think we need to continue to make that point, and it's something that the press will have to monitor really internationally. When I look at what is being done in public relations in some areas, I wouldn't call it public relations. When I see the development of public relations in the United States, I look at it in 3 stages. And the first one is what I would call a propaganda stage. And that era really started with Sam Adams in the Revolutionary War period, where he learned to use the media very effectively. And it went all the way down through P.T. Barnum and the yellow journalism period, you might say. Then, as our communications technology really developed, we got into what I would call a media relations activity, which was pretty much a one-way communications effort. And now we're in what I would call a mutual understanding, where we're working to increase public understanding of our particular needs as organizations and what we're trying to do so that we can maintain that support. Well, when I look at developing countries, many of them are still in this propaganda type of phase. And basically this says that the end justifies the means. And so we've got to analyze what is occurring there. And again, it boils down to image and what is reality matched with the image.
Now you speak of developing countries, but in our country we have developing institutions, and some institutions do not have the experience of other institutions. It's not just focused upon the third world.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and of course we've not always been that good at it. We can go back to 58, 59 when Gary Francis Powers, the U-2 plane, was shot down over the Soviet Union.
Right.
And our first reaction was denial. We don't know anything about it. You don't get away with that.
No, and that memory continues a long time. It's kind of going back to what Jack says in terms of universities. That image that you have, you live with for a long period of time, and we're still trying to live down the U-2 incident worldwide.
Well, I think we see a lot more today in society. The consumer is almost always right. You raised the point about responding to consumer complaints or inquiries. And I think today there is no substitute for viewing the consuming public, whether it be selling them something, selling an institution or a product. The consumer really always is right. You need to respect the rights of that individual, and if they're unhappy in any way, shape, or form, you need to respond to that unhappiness. That's why you see a lot of stores today, you know, there's no quibble, return guarantee kind of thing, you know. What they're basically saying is if for whatever reason you don't like it, bring it back. We're not going to ask questions as long as it's not defective or used or damaged. You know, if it's defective, we'll take it back. But as long as you haven't done anything to break that, we'll take it back. Sam Walton at Walmart has made a lot of money doing that, and you see it now. There are stores coming out now because they are so in tune to the consumer, saying if you can go find the same product at a lesser amount, come back and we'll give you the difference. Now the difference is normally 2 or 3 cents, and most people won't go back, but you still make that offer.
The customer's always right.
That's right.
And the timekeeper's always right. He says we're out of time today. So thank you very much for your time here today, gentlemen. We had Mel Sharp, Professor of Journalism, Coordinator of the Public Relations Sequence at Ball State, Jack Miller, Vice President for University Advancement, and our Executive Producer, John Rouse. I'm Larry Law. Thank you for being with us.
I'm in a hurry.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Nancy Carlson, Steve Johnson, and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.